In our fourth vision, goodness returns to its source. Goodness is at the top of Mount Fuji. In fact, goodness is the ultimate that's also above Mount Fuji. Goodness becomes a kind of agent, the source of all that's good in the rest of creation. My fundamental example is Platonism, which is a whole metaphysic around this relationship between goodness in the world and its source in the realm of the good, the perfect. Plato called that the world of the forms, an ideal place where everything is infinite, immutable, perfect, and what's good in the world that we know participates imperfectly in that transcendent goodness. The world comes from that goodness the way a copy comes from its original, but the copy never really rises to the perfection of the original. And we are here in the fog in a world of transience and disorder. By transience, I mean that we aren't living in an infinite, immaterial, unchanging world. We're living in a world of decay. We're living in a world where things change and become less like what they are when a tree dies and decomposes, or they become more like they are, like when a tree grows up to its true potential. Plato thinks all of those are relative participations in the good. So here we are down in the fog, experiencing transience, and also experiencing disorder, where things are out of right relationship. What is better is sometimes deemed and treated as inferior to what's worse. So we live in a disordered and transient world. Those unwanted qualities of our world are symptoms of deprivation and absence of that goodness in our material world, and even symptoms of vice, habits that are destructive that bring further disorder to the world and keep frustrating our participation in the good. You can see in what I've said here elements of a kind of story of goodness, where goodness is the originating force in the world, but the world that we experience is missing out on that perfect goodness, and actually we're suffering from the lack of goodness that we both inherit and then pass on and even proliferate. And the story of goodness is fulfilled and satisfied as we return to that source, as we tap back into the being that brought us into being, as we imperfect beings tap into the perfect. That sounds pretty abstract, and it is pretty abstract because goodness is found in the realm of the abstract, perfect forms. Our world, our concrete world, only is like a shadow of that reality. So you might think of the abstraction of this system as a feature of its vision, as really a manifestation of the way it thinks about goodness. Our ability to abstract, our ability to see the forms reflected imperfectly in our world of particulars is actually a great gift that holds clues that we can follow and start leading ourselves out. Or maybe a better way to put it is start following those clues out of bondage to transience. I'm actually using a phrase from Paul in the letter to the Romans. Out of bondage to transience and into fellowship with the divine, with perfection. You might call that salvation. A Platonist would also call it coming home, goodness coming home, coming back to its source. Here's a Platonistic picture of what you might call the story of goodness, the story of the fall of creation away from its perfect source and its redemption back into fellowship with its perfect source. And this is a vision that's very influential in Christianity, as you'll see. The top of Mount Fuji is an eternal perfection that never changes, never diminishes. And what emanates or extends from that perfect realm is imperfect creation. And here we are, living in a temporal world where things grow and then decline and die. And this is rough. This is not the world we long for. So the story of goodness is about returning to our source, to tapping into that goodness and becoming more and more like the image we were meant to be, closer and closer to perfection. We'll never become merely spiritual or perfect or eternal in the sense that we never change, But as we tap into those qualities, we can become more and more glorious as creatures, more and more good. Well, here's how Christianity absorbed that idea of goodness. Christian Platonism largely changed the terminology, but also largely kept the same framework. Here's how a Platonist would read Paul's passage in Romans chapter 8. I consider that the sufferings of this present time not worth comparing with the glory that's waiting to be revealed to us. The creation waits with eager longing for the revelation of the heirs of God, because the creation was subjected to transience. My translation here says futility, pointlessness. It's the same word as pointlessness in the book of Ecclesiastes, that nothing ever changes, that things decay, and the grave, the cemetery, kind of wins the battle of our lives. Creation was subjected to transience, not willingly, not of its own desire, but because of the one who subjected it in hope. Creation has been putting up with transience because of the will of its non-transient creator, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay, its bondage to corruption, and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Well, the early church read Paul's words and saw the story of goodness, a good creation, returning to fellowship with its ultimately good, perfectly good creator. That is a Christian goodness returns vision. An originally perfect world, a creation characterized by shalom, peace, justice, harmony, glory. And the Garden of Eden embodies that perfect beginning. Well, in the Garden of Eden, we took matters into our own hands. We turned away from goodness, from our source, and in falling away, we came into a state of sin, depravity, and death, decline. So we broke Eden and we broke ourselves. The story of salvation then becomes a story of redemption where we regain our original perfection and glory. God's grace undoes the imperfecting qualities of sin and restores us to our original image of God, restores us to our original perfection. And so we get to return to Eden. That is such an influential mindset that sometimes Christians are surprised to see biblical images of not a new Eden, but a new Jerusalem, with the tree of life from Eden, but not a restoration of an original perfect order. In fact, it kind of shocks my students when I tell them Eden is not a place of perfection. Eden is good, and it's a place where there's no sin, but Eden is a garden meant to be developed. Eden needs human beings to till the soil, to make it what it is meant to be, rather than being a perfect place, which was perfect until we ruined it. No, it was good and undeveloped until we ruined it. Here's another biblical passage that seems right out of the goodness returns vision. It's from 2 Peter chapter 1, where the writer tells his audience, Christ's divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of the one who called us, this is Jesus he's talking about, the one who called us to his own glory and excellence. Look, our Creator, our source, has called us to receive his own glory and excellence. By that glory and excellence, he's granted to us his precious and very great promises. What are those promises? That we may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that's in the world because of sinful desire. 2 Peter crafts this vision where Jesus has granted us the promise of sharing his own nature, his glory, his excellence, and in some sense, his deity, and at the same time to escape the world's corruption that we suffer because of sinful desires. This sounds right out of Plato, and in fact, this vision is influential in Hellenistic Judaism and in some of the Christianity that's even in the New Testament. So it's not surprising that Christians flocked to this picture, goodness returns, to explain how a good but broken creation relates to its good God, who is its source and destination. 2 Peter's passage became the inspiration, along with lots of other passages, of the Eastern Orthodox Church's teaching of what they call theosis, or divinization. Theosis means us becoming like God. St. Athanasius said, God became human so that human beings might become God. We never become creators. Our human nature never becomes divine nature, but we can be in fellowship with divine nature. And in fellowship, we can take on qualities of that now shared divine nature. That sounds like goodness returning. God made humanity in God's image, and now we, taking on the image of Christ, can become like Christ, like God. You see a goodness returns mindset in the prominence of a major theme in the Christian tradition called the beatific vision, that salvation will amount to being allowed and worthy to be in God's presence and see God. When we see him, 1 John says, we will be like him. So being good in this vision is tapping into being itself, into the transcendent goodness that made us exist in the first place, and which desires us to be in fellowship with it. Goodness wants to be with goodness. You see a goodness returns mindset in mysticism of all kinds, in the longing that people have to be in touch with the divine. You see it in Jewish and Christian mysticism. You see it in Sufism, Muslim mysticism. And the beatific vision is the goal in Augustine's theology and in Dante's Divine Comedy, where the saints surround the Lord and we kind of gaze at the Lord for eternity. What could be better? That's a goodness returns mentality, and that's how influential it has been. So influential that a lot of Christians think that's what the Bible teaches about salvation. And they're kind of surprised when the Bible's pictures of eternity look a little different than Dante or Augustine. At any rate, this is a very influential picture of goodness, but it comes with frustrations. This vision produces otherworldliness, a kind of disdain for creation, which we think of as inferior, a disdain for the material world. We think the spiritual world, the world of the forms, heaven, is worth our time, and earth really isn't. Kind of forgetting that God's mission was to come into the world and redeem it. God engaged the world, but a goodness returns mindset can spawn disengagement with the world, where we keep seeking higher up the source of goodness. Christians are often criticized for having an otherworldly ethic, neglecting the problems of the world, neglecting the evils of the world, and just retreating into a mystical prayer or worship life that pays all the attention to God and neglects one another, neglects fellow Christians, neglects non-Christians. Actually, you don't see Jesus doing that, do you? Jesus wasn't much of a mystic. Jesus was engaging the lost. Another frustration of the goodness returns mindset is passivity. If goodness is the agent, if goodness is kind of on mission to draw us back to goodness, then what's our job? Well, our job is to be drawn, right? In the Christian world, this passivity can look like a Christian life that's structured around merely receiving means of grace. We're just receiving doses of goodness that put us into deeper and closer fellowship. What's our job? Just to open our mouths and receive the grace. Or just to open our ears, if you're Protestant, and hear the good news of grace, which draws us to it. Christians get accused of becoming passive as well as otherworldly, and that is, in part, a result of this vision's power over our imaginations. In fact, Christians can become complacent with our failures. When we fall short, when our leaders are corrupt, when our lives don't look any different from the world, we can just point to our need to receive more means of grace, more infusions of transcendent goodness, which just work because of the power of goodness on us. And as a result, Christians have proven able to put up with a lot of mediocrity, with a lot of failure. So frustrations like those produce a temptation to take shortcuts. In this case, a powerful shortcut in the goodness returns vision is to envision a whole creation which is just swept back to its perfect source. The word for that is universalism, the doctrine that all creatures, all beings, maybe all creation is saved. All of it taps into its ultimate being and returns into fellowship. Well, that would be great. And at some level, it expresses God's will. That same letter that I read, 2 Peter, says God wishes everything would come to repentance. Everyone would come to repentance. But the Bible doesn't foresee that outcome. The biblical writers don't foresee every last creature tapping into being itself and returning to a loving, fruitful, holy relationship with their sources. So the goodness returns vision has limits. And the limits of that vision are further sources of frustration from people who want better than what seems to be happening.